How the elite stay invisible while controlling everything. Most people imagine power as something obvious: famous faces, luxury lifestyles, politicians standing behind microphones. But real power has always preferred the shadows. Because the moment people clearly identify who controls the system, resistance begins. So the elite learn to operate differently, through institutions, media, finance, corporations, and influence hidden behind layers of distraction. While the public focuses on celebrities and public figures, the real decisions are often made quietly, far away from cameras. And history shows this pattern again and again. The most powerful people are rarely the loudest people. They're usually the hardest to see. Tonight we're going to explore how invisible influence shapes politics, money, information, and modern society itself. And if these are the kinds of ideas that make you look beyond the surface, subscribe to the channel and share this with someone who still thinks power always wants attention. In 1971, a former intelligence officer gave an interview that disturbed a lot of people in Washington. Not because he revealed military secrets, but because he explained something far more dangerous. Real power, he claimed, rarely operates in public. It operates through influence, through networks, through institutions most ordinary people never question closely enough. And whether people agreed with him or not, history repeatedly shows the same pattern. The individuals shaping societies are often invisible to the societies they shape. Think about it carefully. Most people can name celebrities instantly. Politicians too. Billionaires with public brands. But behind every visible figure exists an entire infrastructure of advisors, financial institutions, lobbying groups, media executives, corporate interests, and private networks influencing decisions quietly behind the scenes. Power has layers, and the deeper the layer, less visible it becomes. This isn't some fantasy unique to the modern world either. Ancient empires operated the same way. In the Roman Empire, emperors often relied heavily on wealthy aristocratic families, military elites, and political advisors whose names ordinary citizens barely knew. Public leaders changed, but underlying power structures frequently remained intact because public visibility creates vulnerability, invisible influence creates longevity. That's one reason powerful institutions often prefer controlling narratives instead of controlling people directly. Narratives are cleaner, more efficient. If you shape how populations think, fear, consume, and behave, direct force becomes less necessary. Edward Bernays understood this better than almost anyone in the 20th century. Edward Bernays influenced by psychological theories. He believed public opinion could be engineered systematically through media, symbolism, and emotional influence. And he proved it repeatedly. Corporations adopted those strategies aggressively. Governments did too. Modern advertising itself became deeply psychological, less about products and more about identity, desire, insecurity, and status. Because people rarely buy only objects, they buy emotions attached to those objects. And emotional influence scales enormously. That's why elite power today often feels invisible. It doesn't always appear as direct control. It appears as influence over systems people depend on daily: financial systems, media systems, technology systems, information systems, attention systems. The average person interacts with these structures constantly without fully understanding who shapes them behind the scenes. And the people controlling infrastructure rarely need public attention themselves. In fact, attention can become dangerous. Look at how many ultra-wealthy families historically protected privacy obsessively. Some avoided interviews entirely. Others operated through foundations, holding companies, political relationships, or investment networks hidden far from public scrutiny. Why? Because visibility attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny threatens control. Meanwhile, public society becomes distracted by surface-level conflict. Celebrity scandals, viral outrage cycles, political theater, endless emotional noise. But distraction itself can become a form of control. A population constantly emotionally stimulated becomes easier to direct psychologically. Fear keeps attention narrow. Anger keeps people reactive. Division keeps groups fighting each other instead of examining larger systems above them. That pattern appears throughout history repeatedly. During various periods of political instability, governments and powerful groups often shaped public narratives strategically to maintain order, support wars, or preserve institutional trust. Cold War again, influence over perception, not always through force, through psychology. And perhaps that's the most unsettling realization about elite power. The strongest systems rarely need constant visible oppression, because once human behavior becomes predictable, control becomes quieter, more subtle, more invisible. And the majority of people never stop long enough to notice the system operating around them. The elite understand something most ordinary people never fully realize. The greatest form of control is making people believe they're completely free while their behavior is being quietly influenced underneath the surface. That's why modern power rarely looks like dictatorship in the traditional sense. It looks convenient, entertaining, comfortable. People willingly hand over attention, personal data, emotional reactions, purchasing habits, political opinions, and psychological patterns every single day through systems they barely question. And those systems have become extraordinarily sophisticated. Today, algorithms study human behavior with terrifying precision. Meta, Google, and other massive technology companies analyze attention patterns constantly, what people click, fear, desire, hate, and obsess over. Why? Because attention is power. The more predictable human behavior becomes, the easier influence becomes. And influence is often more valuable than direct authority itself. That's why the elite don't always need to control everything directly. They simply shape environments where human behavior moves in predictable directions naturally. Advertising shapes desire, news shapes fear, social media shapes perception, financial systems shape dependence. And over time, people begin policing themselves psychologically without realizing where many of those impulses originated. That's modern invisible power. Not chains, conditioning. Look at luxury culture, for example. The wealthiest individuals in the world often avoid excessive visibility, while millions of ordinary people desperately compete to appear rich publicly. Why? Because true elites understand status signaling works differently at higher levels of power. Old money historically valued discretion, privacy, access networks, influence behind closed doors. Meanwhile, public obsession with visible luxury often becomes distraction itself, convincing ordinary people that wealth is mostly about appearances instead of ownership, leverage, or control over systems. And psychologically, that illusion matters enormously, because distracted people rarely examine deeper structures. They stay focused on symbols instead. This pattern appears in politics too. Visible politicians change regularly, but major institutional structures often continue operating regardless of elections. Financial interests, lobbying networks, intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, and long-established power circles frequently maintain influence across administrations. That doesn't mean every event is secretly controlled. Reality is far more complex than simplistic conspiracy theories. But influence networks absolutely exist, and history repeatedly proves concentrated money creates concentrated influence. That's not fiction, that's structure. The elite also understand another psychological principle exceptionally well. Most people are too mentally exhausted to question systems deeply. Modern life keeps populations busy constantly. Bills, entertainment, outrage cycles, social pressure, work stress, endless digital stimulation, and exhausted minds become reactive instead of reflective. That's why emotional control becomes one of the greatest forms of resistance in the modern world. The calmer and more observant someone becomes, the harder they are to manipulate psychologically, because invisible systems rely heavily on automatic behavior, automatic fear, automatic consumption, automatic outrage, automatic obedience. The moment people slow down enough to question incentives, narratives, and emotional triggers, the system loses part of its influence over them. That's why awareness itself becomes dangerous. A person who understands psychological influence starts noticing manipulation everywhere, not paranoia, but tools. They notice how fear drives engagement online. They notice how outrage spreads faster than logic. They notice how institutions protect certain incentives aggressively. They notice how attention gets redirected constantly towards surface-level conflict instead of structural questions. And once someone sees those patterns clearly, they stop interacting with the world the same way. That's the real reason elite power often prefers invisibility. Not because hidden people are magically controlling every detail of society, but because systems function best when most people never stop to examine who benefits from them. Invisible influence survives through distraction, emotional conditioning, and public inattention. And the moment large numbers of people begin observing systems critically, power dynamics start changing. That's why awareness matters. Not blind fear, not obsession, awareness. Because the goal isn't to become paranoid about the world, it's to become conscious enough to stop moving through it unconsciously. And if these conversations make you look beyond headlines, appearances, and surface-level narratives, stay connected to this channel. The deeper you understand influence, psychology, and power, the harder it becomes for invisible systems to shape your thinking without you noticing. Until next time, pay attention to what constantly demands your attention.